That should be live. Okay, I apologize. Actually, I think we're starting right on time. That's a surprise to me as well. I am streaming on YouTube right now, so the recordings will be there. Let me pull down the Levitsky and Way so that I can share it, and we will be ready to start. I don't have a lot of people here. We're going to give it a minute. So if you're watching this, right, that we're going to take a minute. Okay. So why is this declining? A lot of people. So could you, I only have one attendee right now, so could you type in chat to make sure that you can hear me? And then, I don't have anyone. Oh no, okay. So we've got a playback. So if you're watching this on YouTube, just let me know that you can hear me. And then the same goes for WebEx, so just let me know that right, because I don't have anyone in the classroom right now, so it's just these two. It seems like people like the YouTube a little more. I have a few more viewers. I have so much content to cover, so although I'm missing basically everyone. Okay, perfect, thank you. So I think both the other answers can hear me. I can see your questions, right? If you want to actually like talk through your voice, you have to use WebEx. But one of the things that I found out is that the audio quality on WebEx is really bad. And I'm already speaking through a mask, right? That I'm in an actual classroom, so I have to wear a mask. That it's harder for me to project and to be articulate with this mask on. And of course, keep wearing your mask, right? We want to be safe. You have to survive this semester before you can pass the semester. But I was really disappointed by the WebEx quality. And then at some point between last lecture and say like between Tuesday and maybe Thursday of this week, someone added a password to the WebEx recordings, and I didn't add that password. So I don't know if that's my supervisor who didn't, right? If it was, they didn't tell me. I don't know if that's like a natural thing that happens with IT, but I don't even have that password. So WebEx has proven to be unreliable with recordings. I know that people on YouTube, it's really, really easy, right? That you can just go to my channel and it's right there. It's very easy to find. So I like that aspect of the recordings. I like that it's available, and while audio quality is not perfect on either, the YouTube audio quality it seems to be better. The other part is that, right, is the announcement. If you haven't read the announcement, please do. I mentioned a couple of things, and I think the one that impacts you the most, right, is that the Levitsky and Way chapters we just read, the introduction and theory, there's so much to unpack there, and I don't want to just cram information, and then test. I want to give you a chance to sort of connect. And if this were a classroom, we would discuss it, and I could see how the pacing went, but I can't do that. And so I sort of looked and said, this is so much material, this is a 200 level course, I don't want you to get overwhelmed. So chapters 3 and 4 that we were going to read next week, we're just not going to read them. And if you've already read them or you want extra credit, you can do the same thing with the Fuller article. So now there's a lot of extra credit available, right? Everyone can do better. The other part is that after next Friday, you go into spring break, which I don't know what type of spring break you're going to have with all of this, but I want you to enjoy your spring break, right? It's there for a reason, right? If it was just like, oh, everyone go party and then come back, that's not what we're looking to. In the winter, right, we have sort of Thanksgiving weekend, and the reason why we sort of spring break is for you to like take a moment. You just had some of your exams, recharge your batteries, rest, relax, and get back together. So I don't want to give you a bunch of stuff due over the spring break. So after we cover this material today, when we go into Friday, next Friday, the exam's going to be open. I'm only going to lecture in the first part of this course. I'm going to give you the second part of the course to take the exam. So I want to give you a little time back. I want to reward you for sort of sticking with this course so far. And then it's going to be 30 multiple choice questions and one short essay, right? Essays as the same as the exam one, but only one of them and 30 multiple choice questions. Now you have all the time in the world. So if you want to research and make sure you get every question right, that's a possibility. But if you feel like I've done so much work and I've prepared and I'm already doing all the course, the thing is you only get one shot at this, right? But you have as much time as you want to take it. And so do the best you can, but what you can do is you can finish it Friday, right? You can do it during class time between 10 a.m. and 11:15. You can get most of it done, or you can get all of it done on Friday, and then you can have your spring break. Now on the other end, if you're like, I'm not doing so in the course, I want to do this, I can't have something due during spring break, so I extended the window, the open window for the exam 2 all the way until the Sunday that is considered the end of spring break, right? So you have like, I want to say 10 days, right, to take the exam. And you have an unlimited amount of time to do the exam, and it's just 30 questions and one short essay. So I'm giving you all of this time. You can manage your time as you choose. And so when you're going through the exam 2, I really want to set you up for success. And so next Friday, we're just going to do an AM review, which I will record on YouTube, right? This is going to have to be a solution. I think I forgot the charger cord, so if the YouTube cuts out like around 10:30, I will make a second recording and a different time to sort of catch you up, right? Because I packed like 100 things and one of them was not the power cord. So we'll keep going. So with that said, let's get into the actual lecture so we can move along. Oh, I don't like that. Sorry, OBS is not cooperating very well. Okay, so the first is you do have a paper due, so I want to just show you, one is the citation, how you're going to get a citation from such a pain. Okay, so how would you get a citation from this book that we just read, right? Which could be a big part of your paper, right? Clearly, I have it posted here, but the part I want you to notice is really easy to get a citation together. All you have to do is go to the library website, look up the source that you're talking about. There's a citation button. Click that citation button. It has a copy to clipboard button. Copy it and then paste it into a works cited page. And then you're going to use in-text citation. So getting the citation should be really easy. The computer sets it up. I prefer Chicago, but I'm not going to penalize your grade either way if you use a different citation style, right? Because it's all there for you. That's not what I'm trying to teach you. That's an English class. That's a job for another course. I'm not worried about that, right? So the next part is something that's going to be a little more difficult, right? If you look, this is the way I want you to cite the material. So here, if you notice, no quotes. Do not give me quotes, right? It's not beneficial to you. It's not beneficial to me. I don't know what to grade because did you understand it or are you just pasting a quote from the material, right? That doesn't demonstrate knowledge. What I need you to use your own words. And then when you look at the citation, right, don't include the author names or the article name or the book name in the material. That's filler. That just takes up space. Just talk about what you're going to talk about and then add this in-text citation. And it's just before the period at the end of the sentence, you're going to add in parentheses the author last names and then comma year. And that's it. right? That's it for in-text citation. That's all I need, right? But what I don't want, right, is quotes. What I don't want is you to say, in the Levitsky and Way book, comparative authoritarianism after the Cold War in chapter 4, and then you name the chapter. All of that is filler. I know what you're talking about, right? Tell me what you're talking about. So go through that process that way, and I think you'll be able to provide more information. Why am I talking about this today when you have so many other things on your plate? The most important aspect is that there is an early submission of papers, right? On March 26th is the deadline for early submission. Not for when you have to turn in the paper, but early submission. The first part is early submission, you automatically get bumped up a letter grade, right? 2 points extra. Now, your paper can exceed 20 out of 20, but if you write an A- paper, all of a sudden it becomes a full credit paper. If you write a B paper, it becomes an A paper. And that's just because I'm recognizing that you're turning this early, which means you didn't have as much time, but also you're easing the transition for both of us, right? I can get it graded faster so you can know where you're standing in the course, but also at the end of the semester, I have less papers to grade, right? So I want to reward you for making both our lives easier. The other part is if you submit it early, and it's a full paper, right? Don't send me 2 paragraphs and say I submitted it early. If you submit me a paper that covers all the requirements, I'm going to take notes and say, here's all the things that I think can be fixed on it, and then here's your grade. And if you don't already have an A, including the extra credit, you can resubmit it up until the paper deadline. And the paper deadline is April 30th at 11:59 p.m., right? So if you want to turn in the paper early and you're like, I'm worried about my grade, I want to turn in a 5-page paper, right? Because it's 5 to 7 pages, but right, realistically, most of yours are going to be 5 pages. And submit it and say, here's what I have, here's what I'm thinking, and what can I fix to make it a better grade, right? I'm giving you an advantage for extra credit, for early paper, right, to make sure that everyone can pass this class, right, wherever they're at right now. So now let's talk about what do I actually want from the paper. 5 to 7 pages, right? Now, when I say 5 pages, I mean 1 sentence onto the 6th page, right? That's what I mean, right? A full 5 pages. But don't make it over 7 pages, right? You don't need that much paper, but also usually when you write me like a 10, 12-page paper, you get off topic. Or you discuss something that's not connected to the material, or you pull in something, or you go in to have a long discussion that doesn't have citations. Now, you have to say at least 3 readings from the assigned readings, right? So take 3 readings from this course that are listed in this current, right, in this syllabus, or you can contact me and be like, hey, you talked about, Scotch Pole, and I found this citation on Scotch Pole, right? You can discuss with me if you want to use other citations, but you have to do it beforehand, right? But the easiest way is you've already been asked to read this material. We've already been tested on the material. So just take the material you already have and incorporate it into a paper. You have to take the theories from the readings that you cite and explain, right? First you're going to say, I have a question. I have a hypothesis, right? And I want to test this hypothesis. I think that, right, that in countries with higher levels of education, we should see less children, right? That's a real research design that has been tested, right? That if you give women more access to education and they have higher levels of education, they'll end up having less children. But you want to see where it's coming from, right? Let's say that's something you want to discuss, right? Not in a normative setting, just does education change the behavior of females in a society? So then you look at the theories. What are the theories that exist, right? And we know that we can pull theories from a bunch of different places, right? In the Scotch Pole reading, Ted Gurr talks about frustration, and that's why people fight. And if we look at, right, Geddes, and Geddes saying selection is biased, right? You have error in your results because you're only looking at places. So if you only look at places with high education, you could say, well, we think that females have less children with high education, but we're only looking at high education states. Let's look at all the states, right? Let's use that theory provided by Geddes. And then other readings, right? What's the theories behind, what were the theoretical arguments that led you to have this question and support your argument for this question? And then that's going to be about 3.5 pages, right? And then an intro and conclusion paragraph. And then the last page, right? The last page before the conclusion, I want you to talk about research design. How would you test your research? And don't just say I run an experiment, just say I would do a case study. Explain cases, right? If you're saying I want to do a case study, I think that cases like Russia and South Korea make good cases to look at this question. Or I think this is an objective ontology, right? That I think that this is just sort of real world and so we can count it. And so I want to use all of the countries and I want to count their education level and then I want to get a count of the number of children. And that's my independent variable, dependent variable. And really discuss the stuff that we covered so far about how to run, right, a research design, right? And then stop. Don't actually do the research. Don't do the statistical regression. Just say, here's the question I have, here's the theory connected to that question, and here's how I would test my question, my hypothesis, right? And then say, okay, in my intro conclusion, right, here's the theory I'm going to discuss, and here's the research design I'm going to do. In conclusion, it says, this is the theory I discussed, and this is right. Intro and conclusion, you want to write last, right? Write your argument for the question and the theory that you're covering, and then the research design, and then your intro conclusion should be the last parts, right? Once you hit about a little over 4 pages, then write an intro and conclusion, all of a sudden you're over 5 pages and you're done, right? And if you're like not a complete 5 pages, right, am I going to immediately mark you down? No. But it's unlikely if you're 3 pages that you're going to cover enough material. Now, I'm going to write an example paper between now and next Friday, so everyone has an idea of what I expect, right? That's going to be an A paper, and I'm going to try and make an A paper for this course. I'm not just going to write some amazing paper and say, here, I can do this, right? Because as a PhD student or as a person with an advanced degree, I want to show you what I would like to see for an A paper, what meets the standards for an A paper, and the rubric to really explain how the paper will be set up. So that's a really quick and dirty sort of version of how you can get a paper submitted. If you have questions, right, you can always ask me. We can always discuss it. I have my office hours available, but for now, I really want to cover this material to the best of my ability. The other part is I'm not going to take a break at all. There's so much to cover, and I'm worried about the battery life, and so we're just going to go from now until 11:15, because I want to cover everything. The reason I want to do that is you can come back and review, but next Friday I just want to say, let's look. I already wrote the exam. Next Friday I will have written the exam, right? And I'm working on it, but I don't want to make it too difficult. I want to find a balance there where it's not too difficult, but it is challenging. Next Friday, I want to be like, look, I wrote the exam. I know what's on it. I know what you're going to need to be discussing. So here are the things that I would like you to look at, right? And I'm not going to really go into detail about every single thing in the way that I am today, because I want to say we covered this. So you can go back and look at today's lecture and, it'll answer questions about these material topics that are going to be covered, right? And obviously Robert Dahl's polyarchy is going to play a big effect, and then electro-authoritarianism, oil and how it affects autocratic regimes, and then of course the lecturing way. Those are just the broad topics that we're going to cover. So let's get into today's first lecture. Levitsky and Way are talking about a change in the world, right? They're talking about how the world changed. And one of the big changes that occurs between 1989 to 1982, and the reason I'm giving a range is in 1989, a bunch of Soviet states, they become independent. But in 1992 and sort of 91 to 93, the Russian economy collapses, they can't pay their soldiers, and so the entire system collapses over a 3-year period. But the end result of this is that the Cold War ends. And so the Soviet Union had been propping up a lot of regimes. A lot of regimes have been relying on the Soviet Union for funding. And a lot of other regimes, right, had been sort of connected to the West, but the West was fighting against, right, this ideology of communism, and so it would prop up autocratic regimes and dictatorships because it didn't want communism to proliferate. And there was a belief among Western and American policymakers that dictators were more able to resist communism than a democracy, right? If you have a democracy, they could just vote in a communist party. A dictator would be willing to crack down. So both the Soviet Union and Western states would prop up these regimes, and now all of a sudden there's no Soviet Union, so that money's gone, and the West no longer needs to protect against communism, so that money's gone. And so then you have this sort of pulling away of resources, right? Whether it's military aid, we'll talk about military aid and other types of aid in a second, but what happens is you have all of these regimes that were dictatorships or monarchies or some other non-democratic regime, and they become competitive authoritarian regimes, right? They have elections, they have opposition parties, and the belief among many scholars is that they're in a transitional period. They're transitioning towards democracy, or they're democracy but flawed. And Levitsky and Way say, no, they're not on their way to democracy. This is a type of authoritarianism that just deals with the incentives of the existing system, right? The new system wants you to democratize, but the pressure's only going to do so much, right? It's only going to incentivize so much, so you're going to behave like a democracy, but you're not really going to be a democracy. So then we get into a definition that we have to deal with. And one is called single party rule. A lot of places that were dictatorships become a single party. Only one party is allowed, the party controls all the state resources, and only those in that specific party can run for office, right? That's not competitive authoritarianism. That's essentially dictatorship through party rule, right? Instead of a single person running as a dictator, right, or sort of a monarch or single leader, right, now you have a party that runs everything, right, or an oligarchy, right? One of the concerns about Russia, right, is that you have this oligarchy and it doesn't matter, only one party can truly be in power, right? For those of you that are watching the news, right, that opposition leader Navalny in Russia, right, he was arrested, right? And there are concerns that he's been poisoned before, right? He's being discriminated against. So there's not really a way for the opposition party, it's not really allowed to run. That's not what they're talking about. Levitsky and Way are talking about a competitive regime. And part of that is that opposition parties are allowed. You can have an opposition party. That state resources are allotted by policy. There are rules that say here's where the resources go. Even if the rules don't really fit to where they support all people, right? If one party is located if the supporters of one party are mostly in the south, then the policies might direct resources to the north, but it's still state policy that's directing resources. And then all the parties can run for office. They may not be able to win, but they can all run for office. So now let's give a real definition to what they mean by a competitive authoritarian regime. The first is that they're talking about a civilian regime. Now, if you look at Egypt today, or if you look at Iran today, right, they have sort of leaders that aren't elected that are in charge. And one of the things about democracies and civilian regimes is that above the generals, right, you have the generals here, and then you have a commander-in-chief that's a civilian, right? This is a big thing in democracies, right? The president is not part of the military, but controls the military, right? It is the civilians in control of the military in a democracy. In an authoritarian regime, military leaders are above the elected leaders and sort of control, right? Or in a tutelage regime like the theocracy of Iran, right? The ayatollahs are above the elected regime. So the first part is to say, no, when we say competitive authoritarian, civilians are in charge, right? It's not military leaders in charge, it's not a theocracy. We're not talking about those type of authoritarian regimes. We're talking about a specific type of authoritarian regime that's competitive, and we want to have this definition for a reason. The other part is that there has to be democratic institutions for it to fit this definition, right? You have to have elections. You have to have a legislative branch. You have to have a basically independent judiciary, and you have to have an executive branch that is in some way balanced against the legislative and judicial branch, right? The executive branch has to deal with the other branches. It can't just run roughshod, or else then you just have a complete authoritarian regime, right? Not some modified authoritarian regime. The next part is that it meets a lot of Dahl's procedural minimums, right? A competitive authoritarian regime has often been called a democratic regime because it has free and fair elections. It has adult suffrage, right? Everyone can vote and everyone can compete in elections. You have legal protection of civil liberties, right? The law says that you have rights and liberties, right? It may even have a constitution, right? And there are no non-elected authorities, right? And that goes back to sort of military leaders and religious leaders, right? That the leaders are elected, right? And so that's our definition, right? And if you notice, for a lot of cases, it would seem like this is a democracy, right? The problem is that it seems like a democracy. So Why are Levitsky and Way saying, no, we need to have a different case? It's because of this level playing field that was discussed. And they're saying this is a requirement for democracy. You have to have a level playing field, right? If we're both playing a game, right, and we've discussed in the past, like, I don't know if we have discussed this, but sort of the Monopoly example, right? That if we all are playing under the same rules, right? We're all playing Monopoly, the board game, right? And the same rules, you both get $200 when you pass go, and you can buy properties. But if someone in that group comes in an hour late to the game, and all the properties have been bought up by the people who started playing the game at the beginning, yeah, there is the same rules, we all have the same rules, but that person's obviously going to lose. They're not going to have the resources to buy properties. They're going to run into more properties that are owned by other players. The likelihood that that individual wins is very, very low. And so that's a concern about a level playing field, right? We have to have the same rules and sort of the same positions. Now, in every democracy, there are incumbent advantages. There's always incumbent advantages, right? So we want to have an idea that, yes, there's always going to be advantages for individuals who are in charge, but are they so advantageous that they make it difficult for the opposition to win any sort of power? And so incumbent advantages include patronage jobs. So if I get elected, I'm going to hire some of you to work for me, right? That's a patronage job, right? Even if you're not qualified, right? I'm going to hire you to work for me, and you're going to get a cushy government job, and you're not going to have a lot of responsibility, but you're going to get paid well, and sort of that's the reward you get for supporting me. And that's in almost all democracies, right? That Bush once appointed as the chief of, I want to say, Homeland Security, then the individual's only qualification is that he once ran a horse racing league, right? He had no security qualifications. He was just a friend of President Bush, George W. Bush, from 2000 to 2008, right? That was just a patronage job. You supported me, you helped me get elected, here's a job, right? The next thing is pork barrel spending. Sometimes we call this earmarks. So if I get elected, I want to stay elected. So I'm going to convince the government to build a bridge near us, or a solar panel, or a water park, or something that I say the government would be better off spending it, and it would be better off being in my neighborhood. And so that's a normal incumbent advantage. The next is clientelist social policies. So I'm going to pass policies that serve my constituents, the people that were supporting me and my party to get me into power. Now that I'm in power, I'm going to support them. Right? That's a normal thing, right? That Republicans and Democrats have different policies because their voters, their constituencies are different, right? They pursue policies that are in favor of their groups, right? Why are Republicans sort of pre-2016, right? Why are conservative Republicans concerned about rural voters? Because rural voters are Republican voters, right? They vote Republican. So they're going to want more agriculture bills. They're going to want more, right, rural spending, more rural infrastructure, right, making sure that everyone has access to the internet. Whereas Democratic voters, right, they're going to be more focused on this idea of how do we make sure that our sort of urbanized groups, right, are getting the best that they can. More buses, more sort of mass transportation, right, clean air, because clean air is more of a problem in cities, right? And so all of these issues are very normal, right, for an incumbent to have sort of this special advantage in a democracy, right? And then the last is privileged access to media, right? If you're the president, every news network wants you on their channel, right? That's just part of being president, that everyone wants access to you. And so that is a normal behavior. So when does it rise to the level of unfair competition, right? The first is when the state either runs or owns through proxies all of the media, right? Russian state TV, it's called Russian state TV, right? And the people in the media, right, they are in a specific position where they are getting funding from the government. The same thing with the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Channel, right, they're funded by the government. And so if they don't follow certain policies or behavior of the government, right, they're going to get censured, they're going to lose funding. And so you do have unfair, right, coverage in the media because the state owns the media. And then the last part is the other part that makes really clear that competition is unfair is skewed access. So if you do have independent media, but if they don't support the existing regime, they could get taxed more heavily, or they could lose sponsors, right, out of fear, right? Then they're only going to run ads that support the party in power. And that's going to create an unfair competition, an unlevel playing field. And so Levitsky and Way say this is really important. We need a level playing field to fit the definitions that we want, right? And so if you don't have a level playing field, it's not a democracy, it's a competitive authoritarian regime. So the first part is, so let's look at free and fair elections, right? That was the first part of Dalton's democracy. Compared to an authoritarian regime, you can run for office, right? There's no formal bars against the opposition party from running from office. There's no parties being sort of openly repressed, right? Where we go and break up their meetings and we arrest political opponents, right? And there's no widespread fraud that is recognized. And here's where we get into this authoritarian regime versus competitive authoritarian regime that's a little more nuanced. There's always, right, when we're talking about authoritarian versus competitive authoritarian regime, there's always amounts of fraud, right? But if fraud is widespread and no one cares that it's being recognized, then that's a full authoritarian regime. In a competitive authoritarian regime, the behaviors are a little different. Right? You have to be subtle. So voter intimidation doesn't occur by beating up people who vote for the opposition, but just sort of standing around, right, polling places, wearing the political party of the incumbent political party sort of signs and colors and symbols, and just sort of trying to intimidate those people from coming to those polling places. It also includes a behavior called ballot box stuffing. So you can't really like have widespread fraud, but what you can do is take all these people that you know aren't going to vote or that don't have access to a polling place, and you take all of those names and you just stuff them in the ballot boxes for you turn them in to be counted, right? And because you are the state and the party and the state are so connected, right, your party has a big role in running the elections. And so it gives you access to the ballot boxes that the opposition party doesn't have, right? And we're assuming that opposition is unable to view the vote counting, right? And then also just removal of eligible voters. Sometimes we talk about purging voters, right, that haven't been updated, right? When does purging voters eliminate voters who were going to try and vote but now aren't registered because the government removed them from the lists, right? And so that manipulation can turn into competitive authoritarian behavior. So the next part is we said that for a competitive authoritarian regime, that has to be guaranteed civil liberties. And here we talk about de jure versus de facto. De jure means by law, de facto means in practice. So the law says that you have civil liberties that are guaranteed. There's not going to be a lot of arresting or killing opposition leaders. But what you will see, and we're going to talk about this a couple times as we move forward, is you find new ways to repress the opposition group. And one of them is called legal repression, right? It's technically legal. And it happens a couple of ways. The first thing is tax repression. So you say to a group, you didn't pay your taxes, right? And tax code is always difficult enough to manage that there can be some way for the government to claim that you didn't pay your taxes, then charge you, right, for those overdue taxes and say, well, you didn't pay it 3 years ago, so now we're going to seize your property, right? It's technically legal, but it's a form of repression of the opposition party. The next thing is corruption claims. Now, corruption among competitive authoritarian regimes is in both parties, right? They're both sort of misusing funds, right? Sort of allocating them in appropriate ways, reporting it, not fully reporting different aspects, right? And so when we know that corruption is part of a regime, the incumbent regime's powers, it's when it's only applied to opposition groups, right? Corruption is known to be widespread in certain parts. Like, whether they would consider corruption in India, right, a lot of times if you want to do business, there are side payments and kickbacks and what we would consider corruption in the American context, But both parties do it, and the crackdown applies to both parties equally, right? The incumbent party and the opposition groups. And so India is not using legal repression. They just have widespread sort of kickbacks, and it's part of that culture, so it's hard to tell if it's corruption or if just engaging in business always incurs some costs, right? If that's the way that that business happens in the context of the Indian subcontinent. But when we're talking about this in a competitive authoritarian regimes, it's only being applied to the opposition groups. We only care about catching corruption when the opposition group does it. And then the last part, which is very, very sort of insidious and difficult to tell if it's authoritarian or just normal democracy, is defamation laws, right? We've talked about this before. I'm going to sue you to say that your independent media is saying things that are maliciously false against my candidate, and I don't have to back it up because I can pressure the courts to say you're at fault, to say that that media is at fault. And so it closes some independent media, but the other thing that happens, which is a little more stressful, is the media itself starts to self-censor. They avoid criticizing the incumbent party out of fear that they might get punished. And so this is really effective because once you get them to self-censor, you don't have to repress. You can sort of just leave that fear there, and it's authoritarian. But to the outside world, it looks very democratic because you're not imposing some will on the independent media. It's censoring itself. And so, of course, all of that leads to an uneven playing field, right? That the state has access to resources, right? They can use state resources to fund re-election. They can take government funds and say, okay, I'm going to take $3 million out of the government, right? Out of the taxes taxpayers paid, or out of rents paid through oil and other natural resources, and I'm going to run my re-election campaign with those funds, right? That's obviously an uneven playing field because opposition groups don't have access to those resources. Or they could mobilize government workers, right? And in authoritarian regimes, right, remember that teachers and educators and bureaucrats, these are all state employees, right? They're all government employees. So if your teacher and your mayor and everyone along your government entity is saying the incumbent's the best, go out and vote for the incumbent, that's an uneven playing field. They have too much access to the public and the voters, and those individual government workers have to support the incumbent party or they could lose their job, right? So it's definitely an authoritarian behavior with the guise of a democratic institution. The other part is de facto ownership of the private sector. So often the state resources will be used to buy industries, corporations, right? That a building will be nationalized where the government takes control of it, and then it will be given to someone in the party. So technically it's still the private sector, but it was allocated to a party member, and so therefore the differences between what is private and public is muddied, right? It's not clear. And then if you have, right, we already talked about this, right? If you have your own private industry and if you choose to join the opposition, say you're a steel magnate in Bolivia, right, and you say, I'm going to join the opposition, I'm going to find ways that you didn't fully pay your taxes or that you violated tax code. Or I'm going to say the government will no longer buy steel from you. And so there are huge risks in the private sector, right, to aligning with the opposition. We already talked about state-run media and partisan coverage, and then biased referees, right? You might have an independent judiciary, an independent election commission, but if I have the state resources and your job is dependent on the government, right, I can intimidate you and say you can lose your job. Or I can sort of allow, right, informal practices to blackmail or bribe the judiciary to change the rules or the election commission to change the rules that favor the incumbent, right? Close polling places that are in opposition-supported areas, right? Or, right, make rules that make it harder for opposition groups to vote, right? Require IDs, right? Have like stringent requirements. Have the election commission make it so that people have to pass knowledge tests to be able to vote when you know the opposition groups hasn't been provided schooling or access to schools and their communities. So why do we care so much about this uneven playing field? Right? What happens? And the part that matters for us when we're talking about this from a scientific perspective is that it changes the level of uncertainty in elections, right? By uncertainty, I mean not do we know or do we not know, right? Remember, it's not dichotomous. It's is it clear? Is it unclear? How certain are we? And high levels of uncertainty, right? Are those even bad, right? Now, in democracies, uncertainty is really high. We didn't know, right? Even the night of the election, who won, right? To the presidential election, right? We didn't know at that point because all the votes hadn't been counted. A week before that, polling was close. We weren't sure, right? Up until an election occurring in a democracy, it's not really clear who's going to win, right? And part of that is a problem for authoritarian regimes is they don't like that. They don't want to just find out with everybody else who won the election. They want to make sure that they're going to win the election before, right? And so if you're in a democracy and if you're a scientist and you say, okay, I need to figure out who's going to win this election, you go out and you survey likely voters. You say, okay, you voted in the past. Who do you think you're going to vote for now? You get estimates. You try to get as accurate as possible. In authoritarian regimes, we already know the outcome. The uncertainty is very low, right? We know what we're going to expect. We know the incumbent party is going to manipulate or control in some way the elections. And so what we look for is not how are the voters going to behave, but how much control the party has over the system and how cohesive the party. Because a strong party control that's cohesive on the issues, they're going to be able to push back any opposition leaders, right? And so when you have high in democracy, low in authoritarian regimes, right, and when it comes to uncertainty, that competitive authoritarian regimes, they're in this middle space, right? And so we don't know how much uncertainty there is. But if there's really high uncertainty, then the opposition might be able to win and they could lose power. So we want to point out, right, as we move forward, that this is why a new term is acceptable, right? We never want to have too many terms, right? We always worry about conceptual fusion. If there's 100 different terms for the types of regimes that exist, well, that's a problem because there's only 250 states, right? We need categories that a lot of states can fit into. So when we're discussing what type of regime a state is, it's meaningful, right? Conceptual confusion means I say a term and you're like, great, that term is meaningless, right? When we first talked about democracy, it has a lot of different characteristics, right? Levitsky and Way are saying now you have to add another characteristic. It has to be an even playing field, right? So you have to add that characteristic. And so if you have to add that characteristic, okay, does that mean that we have to relook at democracies? Are some places that used to be called democracy not a democracy? So they say, okay, then we need a new term. We have democracies, right? They have to meet all these standards. We have authoritarian regimes that don't meet any of the standards. And so then we start talking about hybrid regimes. And we have hybrid regimes that are really going to be meaningful. The first that they want to introduce is competitive authoritarianism. They're saying there's a place for competitive authoritarianism. It matters that we use this term because it's going to have the trappings of a democracy, but it's not going to be a democracy because it has some uneven playing field. There's some reason why the incumbent's going to win that go beyond just good campaigning. Also, we want to make sure that we're not talking about other types of regimes, right? We're not talking about tutelary regimes. Tutelary regimes are Iran's theocracy and Pakistan's military leadership. Ayatollahs are in charge. Generals are in charge, right? That's not what we're talking about. We want a category where civilians are in charge and there's democratic institutions, but it's not really a democracy. And so we want to make sure that's clear. And then we introduced last week electoral authoritarianism. And they're saying that's too broad. Electoral authoritarianism just means that there are elections with separate parties, right? That's not clear enough. We need a better term, right? So we can have authoritarian regimes, and we can have democratic regimes, and we can have hybrid regimes. And in those hybrid regimes that are neither democratic or authoritarian, we can explain why they're different. And tutelary regimes are very obvious, right? If the Ayatollah is in charge in Iran, it's not a democracy, right? If someone who's not elected can change the policies, it's not a democracy, right? That doesn't fit the definitions of a democracy. However, if people can get elected, but there's all these things that control it, it might be a competitive authoritarian regime, and then the last part, it might be an exclusive republic or a church of democracy. Yes, you have democratic trappings, but some group can't even vote, right? Some groups are not even allowed to vote, right? They're excluded from public service. Or you could be a restricted democracy, which is very similar to single-party government, where one party is just banned. You can't have a communist party in post-Soviet states, right? They were a restricted democracy because they said no communist parties, right? They had just left these sort of newly independent post-Soviet states. They had just left the Communist Party when they left the Soviet Union, so they banned all communist parties from having any power in their states, right? And so they weren't a true democracy because they were banning it, but they were banning it for a reason, right? They said, we're not going to be communist. Communism is going to take over here. And their incentives, which we'll talk about, why did they care about having these incentives in the process? So now, right, there were incentives following the Cold War, but we've sort of talked about them. I'm going to spend another minute on this. And the first is that when the Cold War ended, right, you didn't need to fund the military of all of these, you didn't need to fund the militaries of all these states, right? You didn't need, right, why does the behavior between sort of the Middle East change after the Cold War when it comes to the United States? Because the United States was no longer using these Middle Eastern states, right, these sort of Eastern European states to sort of set up a bulwark or a barrier against communism, right? The ideology of the United States during the Cold War was containment. We're going to prop up all of these regimes through military aid, economic aid, to make sure that they don't become communist. And we're going to surround the Soviet Union with democratic capitalist states as much as we can, right? Or at least non-communist states to stop the spread of communism. Well, now communism is collapsing, right? The world is sort of accepting that it did not work, right? It didn't work for the Soviets. Their economic system collapsed, their military collapsed. It became very clear in the 80s that their military was not going to be able to keep up with the American military and the Western states military. And so you have this collapse, all this military aid and economic aid just sort of disappears. Between 1989 and 1992, the amount of military aid drops to about 10% of what it was during the Cold War. So all that money is disappearing, and all of a sudden your state, which relied on those resources, is bankrupt. You can't pay your military, you can't pay your police force or your coercive apparatus, and then all of a sudden your authoritarian regime collapses. And so you just can't afford to continue the way they are. And the other thing is there's no ideological alternative. You can't say, I don't want to democratize, so I'm going to turn to the Soviet Union to be a communist state. Or I can't pit you two against each other to say, I want to be just sort of an authoritarian regime, and I'm dealing with pressures from the West, and I'm dealing with Soviet pressures, and so I just have to hold in the middle of this authoritarian regime and sort of appease both. Now there's only Western ideals coming through, and Western ideals are connected to aid, right? If you want to get economic aid, if you want to get a loan, the conditions are that you have to hold elections, that you have to move towards democratic institutions. And so, of course, you're going to become a competitive authoritarian regime if there's no other choice except to be more democratic, or at least look more democratic. So then we get into this new international order. After World War II, right, you have the rise of the UN and the World Bank and the IMF. But for a long period of time, the Soviet Union was sort of stopping those institutions from becoming strongly democratic and sort of principled and democratic norm-abiding organizations. Soviet Union goes away, and all of a sudden the Chicago School and all of these Western ideas, they become the dominant beliefs in these international organizations. Then you have information technology in the 90s start making it that you can look at human rights abuses in real time, right? Why do we care about the behavior of some states, right? Why do we care about Libya and Syria and other places that were going through civil strife, right? Normally, right, if we look at the incentives, the United States has ignored that. But because it was real-time imagery of children, right, in the case of Libya, right, children sort of down on the beach, and I hate to use that imagery, I apologize if it was too graphic, right, but it caused the Western states to say, we need to do something, right? It triggered this behavior. And so information technology changes the interaction between the West and sort of states that were previously autocratic or authoritarian. So international pressure starts to pick up. And there's this argument from Borovich. He writes in a 1978 article where he says, now, instead of states forming the international community, now what we have is a second image reverse. And this first, second, third image is from Man, State, and War, a book by Kenneth Waltz, who sort of controlled international relations. And so what he said is the states, the powerful states, form the international community. And so Gorovich is saying what's happening now, and what's clearly happening after the Cold War, is the international community is forming the behavior of the states. It's backwards. Instead of the states figuring out what the international community be, the international community is forcing behavior on domestic governments, right? And Gorovich says that's backwards, right? You're having non-domestic influences determine the domestic sphere. And so all of a sudden the elites are incentivized to have what's called a facade of democracy, right? A facade of democracy. To behave differently to get funding from Western powers. Okay. So the next part is just because they all become competitive authoritarian regimes doesn't mean that they're all going to follow the same trajectory after this period, right? That there is, now that they have elections, there's the possibility of defeat, right? If they are too repressive and too violent, the international community will condemn them, right? And will take away funding and damage the incumbent's ability to run the government. The next part is that you have a risk of loss, right? You could just lose the election, right? Even if you're ballot stuffing, even if you're trying to intimidate, you don't actually count the votes. And if you're not engaging in pure fraud, at some point you might count the votes and be like, look, we manipulated as much as we could without being caught, but the opposition just had way more support than we thought, and now they've won the election. Now what's the choice? We can't continue to be a competitive authoritarian regime. We have to become an authoritarian regime, or we have to allow the transfer of power and move towards a democracy. And so this creates three different paths for government behavior. So the first of these paths is democratization, right? 15 of the 35 states in the case that Levitsky and Way are talking about come from democratization, right? They just end up with a level playing field. They have a transfer of power. Opposition groups adopt these norms of democracy. The next group is unstable authoritarian regimes. So what happens is you have the incumbents lose power to the opposition, but then the opposition just uses the same resources to disadvantage the new opposition, right? You don't have a democratization and you don't have stability. Power is changing between people, but the way that power is being used does not change. And then the part that is really of special importance to Levitsky and Way is a stable authoritarian regime, right? The incumbents find a way to stay in power over multiple elections and multiple terms, and they do something, right, which we'll talk about as we move forward, that allows them to say, we're only having the trappings of democracy, we're going to stay in power, we're going to be able to have a succession from one leader to the next, and we're going to stay stable for a long period of time. And sort of Mubarak in Egypt until 2012, right, was a clear example of that. Decades of Mubarak being president, having elections, democratic trappings, but no transfer of power for a long period of time. And we'll talk about those very specific rules about how that worked. So what are the mechanisms that allow this to occur in the sort of competitive authoritarian regimes? The first, right, which is obviously going to be a little more clear, is linkage to the West, right? Sort of this density of ties, which in the next chapter we'll get into a little bit more. I don't want to spend too much time. But the biggest question is, does the West care? Does the West care if there's domestic strife in Chad or Zimbabwe, right? Do Western states care about what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa? And for the most part, the answer is no, right? They're not that interested. The other part, does it impact Western interests, right? If you are having strife in Mexico or, right, Armenia, right, that's very close to Western states in proximity, right? And because of that, right, they're going to respond differently. The other part is, do you have oil, right? When Iraq invaded Kuwait in the 90s, right, the United States defended Kuwait, right, because they had an alliance with them. They had an agreement with them to protect them because Kuwait was providing a lot of oil to the United States, right? So it wasn't that they cared because of the people of Kuwait, even though that rhetoric was definitely going to have to be used for any type of conflict, right? It impacts Western interests. So linkage is, do the Westerners care, do the public in the West care, and does it impact Western interests? And if it doesn't meet those criteria, right, then it doesn't cause, right, the Western states to care, and they don't pressure a state to become more democratic, right? They don't get involved. And the other part, which we're not going to talk about now because it's a huge part of what we'll talk about in the next section, is incumbents' organizational power, right? We'll talk about that moving forward. And I just don't want to be redundant in this because we're going to have redundancy in the exam review. The other part, which is considered leverage, right, is this vulnerability. So linkage and leverage are tied, but they're going to pull them out a little bit. So it's actually three factors. But linkage and leverage is one part, and then organizational power is the other part. And this is, are you vulnerable to the West? Do you have a trade agreement where if the West pulls out, you're going to become bankrupt, right? If you sell all of your, right, coconuts or all of your bauxite, which is a mineral found in Sub-Saharan Africa, if you sell that just to the Western powers, then you're at risk because if they say, we're going to stop buying it unless you do what we want, you can do that. And then there are also what are called counter-hegemonic powers. Counter-hegemonic powers are what's this like term called black knights, right? They're like Russia and China. I don't have to rely on Western powers if I can say, well, Western states aren't buying my timber, right? North Korea does this. No one will buy my timber. Well, China says, we'll buy your timber so that you can fund your people and provide your programs, right? So they don't have as much pressure, right? North Korea doesn't have as much pressure because Russia and China are sort of outlets. They allow the North Korean regime to continue by supporting it in a way that works against Western interests. And there are a lot of reasons why they would do this, right? They might just not like Western influence, or they might use it as a target, right? They say, oh, North Korea is bad, you should go after them, but then, you know, while they're directing Western states to put pressure North Korea to democratize, they're also providing funds that they don't have to, right? So remember, this is international relations, why this comparative class? International relations, you're always running this game, right? How do I get what I want without having pressure or accountability from other states, right? You're always trying to run the system, right? And as a state, that's part of your responsibility as a good ruler, is to prevent other states from holding you accountable while also being able to manipulate the rules as best you can for your own state's interest, right? And for those of you that have had political theory or recognize this as Machiavelli's, right? That it's maybe not the moral thing, but it's the ethical thing because you're putting your state's interests first. So now let's talk about theoretical implications, right? And this is what I'm talking about, right? Levitsky and Way say, here's a problem that we think exists, right? Here's a problem with categorization of democracies when they should be competitive authoritarian regimes. So now let's look at existing theory and say, well, okay, what's there? What allows us to be able to say this existing theory exists, right? This existing theory is useful. And the first part is that existing theory says things like, well, you need a certain amount of wealth or equality, right? This is modernization theory. This is 2-4 for peace. There's a book by Trollet and Brainard that was published in 2007, right? And they're like, do you really need a certain amount of wealth to become a democracy, right? India is very poor. It's a democracy. It fits the category of a democracy, but it's very poor, right? And so do you really need societal wealth? So Levitsky and Way are like, that's not a great argument because there are states that are poor that still democratize, right? And there are states that are very wealthy that haven't democratized. Saudi Arabia is not going to democratize, but it has a lot of wealth, societal wealth, right? The next part is this idea of a strong civil society, right? That you have to build civic culture and you have to build people's beliefs that they're part of a larger nation, and you have to organize them and mobilize them, get them to vote, get them to participate in politics, right? That's civic culture. Now, a lot of authors have said, well, how do you identify that? Or is it endogenous, right? Okay, I have civic culture and I democratize, or I democratize and I develop civic culture. What's the order in which it occurs, right? Do you need democratic behavior to big civic culture, right? Or what's the chronology? It's not clear, right? So this argument isn't what they want to use. The next part is international pressure, right? How does international pressure work, right? And so they say there are some effects, right? There are norm diffusion, right? If you just interact with someone from a different society, you might pick up ideas and beliefs of that society, right? Not pressure, but just sort of naturally engaging the ideas of another society might happen. Demonstration effects, your neighboring state might be democratic, and therefore you might say, well, I'm looking at them being prosperous and living better lives as democracy. I want that. I want to live in a more prosperous, free society. So I want to be like them. That's a demonstration effect. You can see someone, right? This is, demonstration effects are a known scientific principle. And so I think in the United States, we talk about, like, if you can see it, you can be it. Like, if you can see someone in a position who's a minority and on TV or in a position of power, then you can believe it, right? That's actually just a demonstration effect, right? This is a known scientific principle. So why we're adopting it in our society now, it has been a scientific principle for a long time. We know about conditionality. I will loan you money so you can develop or build your infrastructure, but I want you to hold elections. I want you to guarantee certain principles, right? Conditionality exists. And so all of those things exist, right? They have their role in Levitsky and Way's argument. And what they add to this, what's their new theoretical contribution, is incumbents' organizational power. And they say an organized incumbent party, right, if they're organized and cohesive, they can stop the opposition, right? They can really come together and stop the opposition. We'll talk about the next lecture. And if they're very cohesive, they can prevent parts of their party from breaking off, right? Remember Scotchbull's argument, right? That for you to have a change, sort of a revolution, the elite has to split off. And if you're cohesive and you could prevent that elite from splitting off, then you're going to make it harder for government transition to occur, right? And so organizational power is really going to matter for these competitive authoritarian regimes. And if you become a scholar of American literature, you'll see party organization is sort of this huge thing in the behavior of all states, right? Even democracies really rely on party organization. What they do want to attack is this assumption of transition, right? There was assumption that all of them will eventually democratize. Everything is sort of on its way towards a democracy, right? If you're not an authoritarian regime, you're on your way. The first part that is problematic here is this idea of a hybrid regime not staying as a hybrid regime, right? That some states stayed hybrid regimes for a long period of time, for decades, right? Egypt stayed in a competitive authoritarian regime for a long time. Mubarak was in power for a long time, but they held elections, they had democratic institutions, but they clearly weren't a democracy, right? So they can be stable, and what they're missing, what they argue, what Levitsky and Way say is missing, is the informal institutions. Often we look at the formal rules. What are the formal rules? Do you have guaranteed civil liberties in the law? Do you have the right to operate an opposition party by the law? Well, that focus ignores what happens when formal authoritarian rule is too expensive, right? Formal authoritarian rule is prohibitive because Western powers are going to make it so expensive through sanctions or conditional loans that it just won't work. So what you're going to turn to is an informal apparatus, right? You're going to have these formal democratic institutions, but you're going to have a coercive apparatus, a youth wing, right, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, a whole host of other non-state actors or somewhat state actors, but not recognized as state actors. You're going to have legal repression. You're going to find all of these informal ways to make sure that you stay in power while still seemingly like a democratic institution. And this is the problem, right? We're ignoring that these informal institutions allow states not to be in transition. They're not in transition. They are a new category that needs to be recognized and discussed. So the next part is a succession moment, right? And succession occurs in this very specific moment where a leader is stepping down and a new leader is stepping up, right? And the leader who's stepping down, right, has a lot of concerns. Because if I leave power, is the new leader or the new party that's sort of the new party organization, are they going to kill me right away? Are they going to exile me right away? Are they going to have the state claim that all my resources were gotten by illegal means and they're going to pull all my resources away? And so I need to find someone I can trust to take over. The problem is trustworthiness, the amount that you trust an individual has nothing to do with whether or not they can get elected, right? I really, really trust my dog. I really trust my dog. I know my dog will always be supportive of me and be with me and protect me, right? That my dog, no one's going to vote. I mean, we're Americans, so they might vote for my dog. But no, right, electorate is going to elect a dog to be president, right? I shouldn't say that because the future is crazy now. But, right, obviously, it makes this clear distinction between being trustworthy and being electable. And so incumbents have this moment where they're like, well, I need someone who can win, and I need someone I can trust. And because those two goals aren't always aligned, right, succession creates a problem where oppositions might say, here's a viable alternative, and it really creates this transitional moment. And so we're always concerned about that. And so while in a democratic system, right, your strategy is always just maximize the vote, right? If you look at parties in democratic states, what they're trying to do is win seats in government. We want to get more votes than the other party, win a seat in government, and so that's how a party wins in a democracy. Winning seats in government, right? Getting the most votes. If you're an authoritarian regime, you're like, how do we consolidate power? How do I get my party members to pull in more resources? So the strategies are different, and in a competitive authoritarian regime, you play what's called a dual game. You want to maximize votes and maintain the existing regime. So part of you is working within the existing rules, right? How do I engage with the government in such a way? And even if you're in the opposition, you might join the government to pull resources away. You're saying, well, the only way to get resources right now is to be part of the government. So even though I'm an opposition leader, I'm going to join the incumbent party so I can start pulling in resources, so I can start setting up the organization of my opposition. The other part, right, if you're saying, okay, I have to operate within the existing rules to get resources, the other part is that the rules could change. You can change the rules of the game, right? You can be in the government, and we've seen this a lot. You're an opposition leader, you're in the government, you're working with the incumbent party to get resources for your community, and then your community is out demonstrating against the government to try and change the rules that exist. So you're in a competitive authoritarian regime, you have the fight over who's in charge with the existing rules, and you have a fight about how can you change the rules. And so this dual game makes succession very difficult. It makes competitive authoritarian regimes very hard to manage because they run into different behaviors. So now let's talk just really quickly about what's actually being covered in the material. We're talking about 35 states. These states became authoritarian regimes between 1990 and 1995, right? So right after the Cold War, all these states go from authoritarian or dictatorship to a competitive authoritarian regime. We're not going to talk about tutelage states, occupied states, failed state. A failed state is where it can't provide any services, right? The military no longer exists, right? A failed state is just complete breakdown, right? That the government basically controls the capital and nothing else, right? And so we don't want to deal with failed states because they have a different behavior. Occupied states, Iraq from 2003 and, till sometime in the last 5 years, right, controlled in large part by the United States military. The United States military dictated behavior, it had troops involved, right? An occupied state, or in the past before World War II, a colonial state, we don't want to deal with that because they don't control their own behavior. It's not domestic control. And then, of course, tutelage regimes we've already talked about. We don't want to deal with illiberal regimes, right? They have democratic institutions, but they're clearly doing human rights abuses, right? Iraq before 1992, right, had very strict rules against the Kurdish people that existed in Iraq, right? They were gassed by the government. They were not allowed to engage in certain behaviors. And there were a lot of human rights abuses directed towards the Kurdish people in Iraq in the late 80s, early 90s. And so we have those issues, right? We don't want to deal with those regimes because they're not even pretending. They're not even trying to pretend they're democratic, right? They're just attacking people who don't fall in line with the powers that exist, right? Those are pure authoritarian regimes. They have to fail to meet one of the 5 criteria for democracy, right? They have to actually not be a democracy, right? So when we're quoting them, they can't be a democracy and be a competitive authoritarian regime. So there has to be some downfall, whether it's the uneven playing field or the elections have some widespread fraud. Some failure of the 5 criteria of democracy has to exist. Opposition parties have to be allowed to compete, right? So it can't be a restricted democracy. You have to have actual competition among parties. And then how are we going to do this? They're going to do an intensive case study, a case analysis, which a case study and intensive case analysis are very similar. We're really going to look at each individual state, and we're going to look at all the categories of each individual state in the same way you would do a case study. And then we're going to develop new indicators to say, okay, here's how level the playing field is. Here's how fair the elections are. Here's how biased the media is. And we're actually going to code a lot of these into place. And we're not going to get into that in this course, but you will likely, as you advance far, this book is going to come up again. And so this is a good preparation for that if you're political science. But I don't want to burden those of you who are not political science majors with it, so I just want you to get an understanding of what it is. All right. So now, we're going to start the next lecture. So now let's talk about regime trajectory, right? Should not have taken that long, but. Now, regime trajectory, we're going to get through a little bit. I'm really disappointed. I just bought a new computer, and it's supposed to have this like really long battery life, and just by running these 2 apps, we're going to stop it in half an hour and take a break while I figure out how to get power to my laptop. So when we're talking about regime trajectory, what I want, the first part is that we've already talked about this, that there are 3 categories, right? I want you to know the 3 categories. Right? There are 3 paths that can occur, right? It can be democratization, right? Unstable authoritarian regimes and stable authoritarian regimes, right? And we've already covered these definitions, so I don't want to belabor that point. The next part is that we clearly have a mixed approach, right? The approach that they take to how this behavior will occur, how this process will occur, is structuralist. What does that mean? That means the outcome is determined by the environment. And there are 2 factors that they want to face. The first is international pressure, right? We talked about post-Cold War that the Western states sort of dictate international systems, and they're pressuring authoritarian regimes to democratize. And the other, right, is a limited ability to provide state resources, right? You just don't have the resources anymore, so you've got to change a bit, right? The next part is that Levitsky and Way say, well, the structure does dictate, but that means you'll be pushed towards democracy. But why do some democratize and some become unstable and some become stable? Well, agency matters. The individuals in those states, right, they're going to be making decisions. And one is a charismatic leader, which we're actually not going to discuss charismatic leaders. So there's a part of the chapter that's like the role of the leader. We're not going to concern ourselves that charismatic leaders is a long, like, psychology, sociology discussion, and it has its place here, but it's just not important to what we're discussing right now. What they're talking about, when we're talking about agency, is can the leader organize and create a cohesive party? And that agency approach is really going to matter. And so what they talk about is a mixed approach. You have the structure, right? They recognize, if you're an incumbent, you say, there's a shift in the international order, I need to do something, right? So I need formal democratic institutions, but I want to stay in power, so I'm going to use this authoritarian and informal aspect, and then I'm going to try and find ways to retain power and make it seem like I'm a democracy while sort of quietly and sort of covertly violating norms of democratic institutions, right? And that's the process that will be followed. And so we will expect that to happen throughout this sort of system. But one of the ways that it happens is going to be through party cohesion, right? That's going to be the major mechanism. So let's look at the existing theory, right? We always want to say, okay, what is the theory that is already available to us? And the first part is diffusion, right? We talked about diffusion. We've talked about diffusion before, right? Ideas are shared between people. Every time two groups of people interact, they share ideas. And they just might start talking about issues, right? People love to talk about politics. It's surprising how much people love to talk about politics anywhere in the world. Despite being very charged topics, they still like to talk and argue about them, right? It's still something that people engage in, right? Everyone wants to tell you their opinion, right, whether you want to hear it or not, right? And so diffusion occurs through this natural process. It also explains why the process is temporal, right, in periods of time, right? Why does the Arab Spring occur in 2011, 2012, 2013? Because it sort of hits, and then it spreads through time, and then within a year or two it dissipates, right? Diffusion hits, it's sort of like a ripple in a pond, right? It hits and then it sort of spreads and then it sort of goes away. And there might have been changes in that process, but it has a short lifeline, right? Diffusion occurs, right, over a certain period of time. And then regional clustering, right? Egypt, right? Tunisia is the first, right? Tunisia sort of goes through its Arab Spring. It has that demonstration effect. And then Egypt and Libya, they're like, okay, what do you mean? Like, revolution is possible, right? We don't have to accept these regimes. There's a way to go about this. And then that demonstration effect causes diffusion, and so you have regional clustering. The neighboring states follow, right? It also explains proximity when we're talking about, right, Western states and Eastern Europe and the Americas, why they have more of that. We'll talk about proximity in a second. The next part, that's the international is direct democracy promotion, right? Powerful states can threaten, they can persuade, right? And they can also just use military force, right? I was in the army in 2003. We invaded Iraq. One of the arguments for invading Iraq was weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to exist. But the other argument, which continued the war in Iraq, was that we were establishing democracy in that state, right? We were changing regime. We were building a new regime, right? It didn't work. We know historically now that it didn't work. They fell into a civil war. They've had part of their state controlled by a new caliphate, right? That ISIS took control of portions of their territory, right? And they're still recovering. And so obviously it didn't work, but at the time it was believed that we could sort of force states to become democracies. And I don't know of any cases where it's worked. I don't think there's one case where we stepped in with the military and they became a democracy and stabilized. It's just not an effective strategy, but it is a strategy that was applied multiple times between 2001 and 2012. After 2012, you have this global recession and regime building loses to how do we keep everyone having a job, right? And jobs sort of, when things are going well, we start looking outward, and things are going badly, it's jobs, right? You hear very little about foreign policy today because we only care about COVID and getting our economy back running. But what you will see is in 2022, as we move away from COVID, as we become vaccinated, as jobs open up, because the economy will grow in the next few months as things open up, right? We're going to start caring about foreign policy again. The next part is multilateral conditionality, right? I'm going to make my loans require that you have certain civil liberties, right? We talked about this already as well, and democracy assistant, right? Post-Cold War, a lot of the assistance funding goes away, but then new funding comes in that says, okay, we want to fund democratic programs. We want to give you money so that you can run an education campaign, so people know their rights and their ability to vote, right? Their ability to organize. They understand the rules and the laws that exist. So we're going to teach you about democracy and democratic institutions, and we're going to provide you funding for that. And the last is transnational advocacy networks. Keck and Sikkink wrote a book in 1998 that is just called Transnational Advocacy Networks, right? And TANS is the acronym. An acronym is a word that, letters that spell out a term, right? That's just an acronym. But when they talk about TANS, these transnational advocacy networks, they explain how they work, right? And we're not going to get into that much. They explain the consequences of them, right? And sort of really get into that. I just want you to know that that's another way, right? A domestic population, a population in a Western state organizes and raises money to influence another state, right? Transnational from one nation to the next, and influence the domestic population of another state, right? It's an international from one powerful state to a weaker state trying to influence domestic policy. So we talked about, right, those things that have occurred. We've talked about Western leverage, right? So let's get into this, right? That we know that it's vulnerability to external pressure. Now, there are some very obvious things that they talk about when it comes to this that I want to make sure are clear. The first is that you have limited bargaining power if you're a small economy dealing with a very large economy, right? The large economy doesn't need you, right, to maintain, but you might completely be reliant on your sale of bauxite or your sale of rice or your sale of agricultural goods, right, to another state, right? That you can't possibly use that all domestically. It has to be exported for your economy to run, and so there's a lot of factors. The other part about leverage is it's only one policy. Democratization is only one pressure policy. In the 21st century, counterterrorism often balances against this, right? Why did the Western states not concern themselves with the authoritarian aspects of Middle Eastern states, Middle Eastern and North African states, is because they were way more concerned about counterterrorism. Counterterrorism was the issue at hand. So that became the primary issue, and because it was the primary issue, right, you see less democratic pressure in that region and more democratic pressures in Latin America, right, where counterterrorism threats are not as powerful. And there are some other threats, but they're not considered at the same level of counterterrorism in the early part of the 21st century. And then we're going to talk about this multiple times, these counter-hegemonic powers. China and Russia at multiple times will try and counterbalance Western influence. And between 1990 and 2008, Japan and France did the same thing, right? France didn't like that the United States was requiring all these conditions, and so it could offer an alternative to some of these states, right, and sort of balance out these democratic pressures by working against what was considered the hegemon at the time. And I don't want you to consider what hegemon or unipole or any of that. The U.S. was considered and is considered the most powerful state in the system, right? And so sometimes other states, which are powerful but not as powerful as the United States, they will work against the United States for its own interests, right? China and Russia will work against Western influence because they want to control their region, right? Russia wants to influence the behavior of neighboring states instead of the United States influencing those behaviors, right? For their own interests, right? If you want better trade relations, right? If Russia wants better trade relations with the Caucasus regions or Georgia or Chechnya, right, or Ukraine, they want to push out Western influence so they can have more power in that region, right? That's just intuitive behavior of any powerful state. So the next part is linkage to the West. And so there are 6 ways that you can be linked to the West. The first is economic. The economics ought to be very powerful. Trade relations, foreign direct investment. If you want investment firms to come to your state, one of the things that many investors believe is that you have to have democratic and, more importantly, capitalist institutions. If they invest, they have to be able to take their money back out. If you're an authoritarian regime and you say, well, I'm going to nationalize the railroad industry, or I'm going to nationalize a specific industry, one of the things that might happen is that when you nationalize, all that investment goes away. So, right, if you're tied to the West through investment, that's going to put democratic pressures because those investors want to have a say over that. The next one is intergovernmental. If you have a military alliance, right, Kuwait is under some pressure to democratize because the alliance, right, NATO countries that are tied to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right, they have pressure to democratize because they have shared treaties and alliances. The next is technocratic. So many scholars throughout the world were educated in Western schools, or they're tied in some way to Western schools. And so that connection to Western schools causes them to carry on, right, Western beliefs, right? They're educated in the West, and they come back to their states with these beliefs about democratization and self-representation and freedom for all, and right, they come back with these beliefs, and they start wanting to build these democratic institutions, and it definitely provides pressure through a technocratic situation. And because they're the most educated, right, they're the elites, the educated elites among that system, they have power to actually change the system. The next is social, right? This is flows of people. If you have immigrants or refugees or diaspora in your state, right? And diaspora means a person of one state who lives in another, right? Israel talks about this a lot, right? That Western Europe was full of Israeli diaspora, right? They were Israeli, but they were living in Western Europe because they had been pushed out, right? Very similar to refugees, but different legal characteristics, right? Diaspora is treated differently than refugees in the law, right? Refugees have certain legal protections. Diaspora don't necessarily have those legal protections because they might have lived in another state for a generation or two, right? If you are Israeli or if you can claim Israeli descendancy, but you lived in France for 80, or your family had lived in France for 80 years, you would be considered diaspora. And so if you have this flow of people, right, your social connection might create linkage, right? And I'm not like picking on Israel in any way, but we know that the Israeli Jewish population that is in the United States, right, they want the United States to involve itself in Israeli policy, right? They want the United States to be connected to Israel. And so while that pushes the United States to protect Israel in a defense alliance, right, in a military alliance, what it also does is it creates all this pressure from the United States onto Israel to be democratic. Right? Some of the democratic institutions are a result of, right, diaspora in the United States putting pressure on Israel to have the same institutions that the United States has. Right? So that's a social linkage. The next is information. Right? One of the things that we found out that was very strange between like 2005 and 2010 was that a lot of Iranian people watched The Daily Show when it was Jon Stewart. Right? The Jon Stewart Daily Show was just a satire. It was a news satire. But because Iranians have satellite TV, they often watched an American show to get information. And so they were getting this Western content, this internet content, this broadcast content, and it was changing their beliefs, right? They would listen to The Daily Show, they would hear Jon Stewart's arguments, and they would influence their behavior. The next part is civil society. And this is mostly NGOs and transnational networks, right? Where organizations come together and they link up with the domestic sphere and they buy into something, right? And the most obvious is sort of like the Red Cross. It's like Red Cross, Red Shield, but there's another term for it in Middle East and North African countries, right? Like Red Crescent or something like that. But that organization is global, right? And they often talk about human rights abuses. And then you have NGOs like Third World Network or Democracy Now!, right, that go and connect with domestic populations, and they use Western funding for these organizations, these non-government, and NGO is a non-governmental organization, and they connect with domestic populations, and they sort of build up these connections through civil society. And they start to say, well, if you form an opposition group against the incumbent because you want to be in power, we'll use our Western funding to help you organize, right? And that's a civil society connection. Now, what explains this? Proximity, right? Geographic proximity has the strongest linkage, right? Mexico and Canada have the strongest linkage to the US, right? The European Union is most strongly connected to Central European states and is less connected as they move to the Eastern Europe and into Asia, right? Just less connected, right? Why is there this Mediterranean divide, right? North Africa behaves very differently than Europe because proximity is different, right? You don't have as many connections because that body of water in the way. So let's talk about these mechanisms of proximity. How does it actually work? Because what a lot of people would say it's normative, it's the beliefs, right? That it's the ideas that exist, and this is not the argument that Levitsky and Way have. They say, no, it's not normative, it's not ideational, it's material. That you care more about election fraud in states that neighbor you because it impacts you more, or because you hear about it more, right? If Mexico has election fraud, you're like, that's right next to me. I should do something about that. If you hear about in Zimbabwe or Sub-Saharan Africa, you're like, I don't even know where that is in the world. I couldn't even point that out on the map, right? Why would I care, right? That you have a heightened response to autocratic behavior when it's closer to you, physically closer to you. The next part is that the domestic groups, right, are shared more, right? We live in the Southwest, right? It is much more likely that someone of Hispanic or Latin descent is going to come from Latin America, right? Or they're going to come from Mexico or El Salvador or places. But if we lived on the East Coast, right, they were much more likely, if we're in Florida, to be Cuban and Puerto Rican, right? They're different beliefs, right? They're different beliefs in different domestic groups depending on where you live, right? I grew up in Northern California, right? There's a much larger representation of the Asian community because of historical factors, right? That there just happens to be a larger Asian community. But if you lived in France, right, your local community would be very different, right? You would be much more proximity connected to Armenia and Azerbaijan and those Caucasus regions because you're actually physically closer. Whereas Americans, when we talk about the Caucasus region and Azerbaijan and Armenia and places like that, they're so far distant to us that we don't have that same connection, right? So this is material. It's not about norms or ideas. It's that you're actually just closer to those power sources and therefore you care more about them, right? And that when things change in those situations, your domestic population is connected to it or your concern about it is different. So proximity plays this huge role that just really can't be ignored. Okay. I really wanted to just keep going because, but I think we do have to take a break. Like one, if you can see the slides, right, we have so much more to go over. And I can do it in the next hour, but I definitely can't just keep going this whole time and get through it. So what I think would be the best choice is to come back at 10:15, and from 10:15, 11:15, get through 20 slides. That's 3 minutes per slide. That's perfectly acceptable, right? So we can get through it. I'm going to find some way to plug in my computer. I think I just forgot the power cord. So I'm going to find some way to get power to this or borrow a laptop or something so that we can all be on the same page. But moving forward, I do want to have this dual system. I hate how it's set up, but the audio quality I think on the recording is better on YouTube. And then I've got sort of split audiences, but I had a larger audience before. So a new stream is going to pop up at 10:14, and at 10:14, 10:15, you're going to see a new WebEx chat. And so when you come back at 10:15, we're going to finish this, and then we'll just have review next Friday. There won't be any additional reading, and we'll move into the exam so you can actually enjoy your spring break. So I will see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you.